Good evening and welcome to Screentone Club. This is your fortnightly discussion on manga, episode 53, being recorded on the 14th of June 2020 for release on the 16th of June 2020. My name is Elliot Page, coming to you from my new palatial mansion up in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. And joining me as always is my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yes, I'm doing well. No palatial mansions here. My share of the podcast money hasn't come in yet, so no palace just yet.
Yeah, well, I say palace. I have a podcasting room, which is nice, although it is also the office and everything else and junk room at the moment. I'm currently sharing it with a whole heap of upset Warhammer miniatures that are going to kick me out if I'm not careful.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the problem now is in our brave new times, one of the main considerations of your office space is, what does my background look like for video conference calls?
Yeah, I went and bought a nice £10 throw rug to put on the wall behind me. Mostly because as at my work, we decided to stop doing, sort of fake backgrounds because everyone kept doing really stupid shit. So yeah, it turns out video conferencing makes fools of us all, once again. But this is an audio podcast, not a video one. Thank Christ. I don't think we could afford the bandwidth. But this is your fortnightly look at manga with a focus on joint discussion. We are very lucky to be supported by our patrons on patreon.com. If you like what we're doing here, please consider supporting us from the mere sum of $1 a month. That gets you bonus episodes. At the moment, due to this whole coronavirus lockdown thing, we're doing 2 bonus episodes a month at the moment. One available for everyone and one kept away secretly for the patrons. If you subscribe, you get all of our previous episodes as well. And if you subscribe from $3 a month, you get to vote on what we cover in said bonus episodes. The voting actually for this month, the month of June, will be done in about 2 more days. So I'm going to harass everyone to make sure they get their votes in because it's a real dead heat at the moment. And the more sort of titles we have to choose from, the better. Also on the Patreon bent, a big shout out goes to Miss Rob Jessup, as always, who supports us at the shout outs tier and so gets shouted out right here. Thank you very much, as always. So, moving on to the main part of the podcast, we have Returning Champions, where we look at series we've discussed before, and we've continued to do so in the meantime off our own back. So, Andy, there's a series you've been reminding everyone about, and I would like to hear what you think about once more, because I also need to get back onto reading this. Whoops. But no, take it away. Please make the case for me to then pick this back up again after this podcast finishes.
Just kind of my occasional catch up of I've been catching up with the 'Tis Time for Torture Princess, which has been sort of my occasional dip into for feel good fun times. Especially with the current state of the world as is. Like, this is very much one of those series where I like to let it get kind of, maybe 6 to 8 chapters behind. And then I'll spend an hour or so just kind of luxuriating in whatever chapters have dropped in the meantime. I don't really have anything particularly new or fresh to say. It is just still, incredibly fun. And this is very much a series that I sort of remember back when we recorded our first podcast about this. We had a few critiques and criticisms of it. And I feel like it's managed to sort of polish its edges quite nicely at this point. I think some of it still stands true, that it still has to go back and lean on the whole, look at this delicious food thing, maybe a little too often, but it's now got enough other strings to its bow that it can actually get away with that and just kind of be enjoyable for its sort of ensemble cast and its general sense of kind of fun and increasing kind of levels of just being sweet, really. Everybody in this series is just kind of great and adorable right the way through to the Demon Lord, who turns out to be the best boss ever. I'm just kind of really just enjoying it for what it is, and it is a very good kind of light-hearted and kind of really, really enjoyable read still.
Yeah, I feel like the force multiplier of the extended cast in that series is kind of undeniable. That's a really fancy way of saying, yo, the cast are good, I like them. It also knows when to take a break from the princess and the sword, but also when to get back to them and have them lark about. And so that's really good, how the series has learned to dole out its really enjoyable characters, honestly.
Yeah, it's also kind of crazy. I kind of admire the author for just not giving a damn about how quickly they burn through their material as well. There are kind of ideas and premises that are put forward in this series that I feel like any other series would take a good few chapters with to like wring every bit of comedy out of them. And this is a series that's just like, screw it, I'm just going to do all this in a chapter. Like there's a recent chapter that just like introduces an entire like isekai element to it. And literally it's just like, I'm just going to like burn this as a single joke and then be done in a chapter. And it's just like, oh, okay. Like I thought maybe we were going to just kind of really change things up. And it's just like, no, I just had this good idea. I just burnt it quickly for one good joke and then I'm done. Now let's get back to a basketball match, which again could have been an entire kind of arc of its own. But it's just like, no, we're going to have one chapter of dumb basketball jokes and then we'll go on to another thing. And I think that actually really works in its favor. That it never feels like it has to kind of wring every last bit out of a joke. Like it does just enough until it's satisfied, and then it's just like, okay, that's cool. We'll do something different next week.
Yeah, I'm not caught up as you are, Andy, but I definitely agree with you there. Like it really knows when to keep things moving, and it really works, as you say. Like it's really fun to read. It's really refreshing. It doesn't get itself tied up. Like it very, very, like it has its structure of princess captured by demon lord, but it's so lip servicey that it never lets itself get caught up and like tied up in quote unquote lore or progression, which is refreshing, frankly. And that keeps it really nimble on its feet. I get the feeling if someone tried to write a wiki about this, they'd probably just go, it's a gag series. What do you want from me?
Yeah. I mean, even the core premise of the series is now just like a running joke that it really doesn't matter anymore. Like it's the entire thing is just a kind of eye rolling. It's like, yeah, sure, torture me. Like, you know, I'm going to tell you whatever you want to know anyway, and we're all just going to have a fun time. Like this entire thing is just like flimsy to its core, but it really doesn't matter because it just lets us do other fun stuff.
Yeah, plus it even knows about the whole food porn aspect where now more often than not, it spends about 3 chapters telling you how it's not the normal food porn, but now it's food porn level 2 or something. You know, the hair gets even bigger. It is kind of that sort of wild thing that I enjoy where the series knows it's a gag series and is willing to just go, yeah, I don't care. Like, this is funny, right? You're laughing? Good, cool, let's keep going.
Yeah. And that is the core of it. Like this series, every chapter kind of gets a decent laugh out of me, and it's just a big kind of like smile plastered on face kind of reading experience. Like my only frustration at this point is I can't believe that this still hasn't been commissioned for an anime adaptation, because as discussed previously, like it almost jumps off the page as being an anime in some shape or form, and I can't believe nobody's looked at it and been like, hey, we should do this.
Yeah, I mean, I can only guess that given that schedules at the moment for anime are completely honked, and you would know far more than me about this, but that's what I have to assume at this moment is people don't really have time to look at picking this up. I don't know. I do hope that it does get an adaptation because it's already really vibrant on the page, and you can, like, not meaning to downplay any of the massive amount of work that goes into an anime, but you could totally lift these character designs and they're basically good to go and will look great on the TV or streaming service nowadays, I presume. So yeah, I would totally watch this in a heartbeat if I had time, and also had to get an anime. So
yeah, but yeah, in the meantime, like, it's free on Manga Plus, so yeah, go check it out because it is a good time.
Yeah, there's like 50 something chapters now. There's a decent chunk that you can totally binge on.
Yeah, for sure. And it is quite a bingeable series as well. Like, each chapter is kind of like, 12, 13 pages. And like I say, it's very much kind of chapter does a thing, does a funny, it's done, on to the next thing. So you can kind of read it in small chunks or just kind of binge it in big lumps as well. And it kind of works just as well either way. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, as I say, at the start of this section, I'm definitely going to go and read it after this because I'm kind of in the mood for it now, even more so. So, moving on to another returning champion is another Manga Plus title that we talked about previously in our Manga Plus sort of catch-up episode that we did as like a pseudo bonus in the main feed, and that would be Hina Change, which finished just this week at chapter 24. I think basically one of the previous times I've talked about this, I think it was another returning champions, I was on chapter 20, which was basically the big sort of like denouement of the series, really. And it has now finished at a rather svelte 24 chapters, although they are long chapters and it was a monthly series. So anyway, Hina Change has ended. I feel like it actually ends really well, which, given how dire things get for the cast in that series is frankly impressive and more than a little surprising. Like, it's not a happy all rainbows ending, and also it's good that it's not, because it totally could not pull that off in any way and have it be viable. Where, like, it ends kind of in a rather sort of heartfelt, like, exhausted place where a lot of messed up stuff has happened, but a lot of people have finally gotten stuff off their chests. They, you know, certain characters have clearly shown themselves to be wretches and bad people, but a lot of growth has occurred, and, you know, people don't quite get off scot-free, but also they don't get damned forever due to their poor decision making. And especially for Hina in particular, it kind of ends in a place of, oh, you are in fact in a better place now after all this, although I'm willing to bet you wish you didn't have to go through all that garbage to get where you are now. Especially Makoto, the like male love interest in the story, who kind of gets the short end of the stick and eventually, like, kind of unfairly has to be the one to prefer his hand in forgiveness/friendship after, frankly, he'd have every right in telling everyone to go fuck themselves and jump off a cliff. But it kind of works out fine. Like, and also I'm just glad it doesn't carry on too long. Like, you could argue it maybe goes on a little too long already in the midsection, but 24 chapters is enough pages for it to get its message out and to finish up a story without dragging on forever. But that's my take on it. What do you think, Andy? Do you think the same or what?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think my biggest the biggest plus and perhaps my biggest relief from the end of this series is that it does justice to Hina's character. Because, totally. I mean, I remember when we first talked about this series, like, the biggest kind of ding we had against it is that it really feels like it dumps on Hina an awful lot in those early chapters, and it kind of, at times it felt like it was being overly kind of cruel and malicious in doing so, but it kind of works through that in quite an interesting way and kind of gives that character growth, as you're saying, kind of closure, and what turns out to be a pretty satisfying manner. So yeah, like, I was kind of glad I read it through to the end, like, having kind of, you know, left off where we initially talked about it on the first time we talked about the series. So I was kind of glad that I saw it through to the end, because I feel like it was a worthwhile experience. I mean, I feel like it does maybe manage to pivot a little quickly from kind of the absolute sort of pits of despair it finds itself in at some point through to a more even footing. Like, I think it takes some, maybe not liberties so much, but it kind of, it feels like it cuts out a couple of steps in its progression somewhere along the line. But I think it does a decent enough job of kind of hiding that almost, that actually that's okay in the end. Like, again, I don't think I'd want the series to be any longer than it is, so it's probably the best way to do it. So yeah, like, it was kind of nice to see it finish in the way that it did, because yeah, I don't think either of us particularly saw a particularly satisfying end coming to the series. And I mean, there is a grand irony that kind of big denouement that you mentioned, like, had that happened like 2 or 3 chapters in, we wouldn't have had half of the problems that the main characters had to go through if everyone had just had their heart to heart of like, hey, look, here's what happened. We've all been really shitty about this in our own ways. Like, let's just get all this out in the open. But of course, you know, this being a manga, that had to wait till the end. But yeah, like, it was a pretty solid story in the end that kind of, you know, it went some interesting places, and it's certainly kind of very different from the kind of the typical stuff that you'll find in this genre. Like, even in the kind of romantic drama sense, it reaches places where most other series wouldn't dare to, and it doesn't always get it right, but I'll give it something for its gumption, if nothing else.
Yeah, I feel like the one thing it does really well in particular is it doesn't like wallow in the despair, although, as mentioned, it does deep dump on Hina, especially at the start. But yeah, it really finds, for me at least, it finds a lot of interesting ways of showing things going bad in very human ways, like people getting tongue-tied and not talking when they should, not communicating when they should, doing things selfishly or without heeding consequences or really considering anyone else, and then like trying to brush off the consequences, which then of course leads to more problems. And so it kind of, like, it's not like wallowing in all the worst shit happening, even though the characters are doing like objectively garbage garbage things, but it kind of makes that come naturally. And so it does mean that, like, at the end, it has to unpick all that lot. And it's not like, you know, people are in a better position than you'd probably imagine, by the end, which is kind of surprising when you look at the start of it. But people have, like, this was, at the end of the day, this was still negative all told, but it still, was important to have it all out. And I think, like, when the denouement does happen, it's a good, like, inflection point of, like, okay, no, this needs to stop, and then we need to close things off, rather than, like, winding up for another arc. So it works for me in that regard.
Yeah, and I think it's done in a really good way, that it's not a kind of a sudden everybody decides, like, oh, hey, let's like have it out here. Like, there are clearly some parties that are not interested in having that discussion at all and just want to carry on, like, beating this dead horse, whereas other characters just like, no, I'm done with this 100%. And, like, I'm willing to do whatever needs to be done to, like, bring this to a head. And I think that all kind of works really well. And I think the other thing that this series kind of actually works pretty well with, kind of towards its latter half, is it kind of takes, like, the selfishness of characters that we've seen earlier on and kind of turns it on its head in some really interesting ways, where the characters that have been selfish kind of, like, prostrate themselves to somebody else's selfishness in a really sort of interesting way. That's just like kind of a realization that, yeah, I've been terrible, I've done some really bad things, but then make kind of almost an equally terrible decision to try and make up for it. And I think there is a very human element to a lot of that stuff that is kind of, like, relatable in terms of relationship stuff. And, it's how you can kind of sometimes end up in sort of unhealthy relationships, because it's like, oh, I have to do this because XXX. And I think all of that stuff was actually quite powerfully done in places. I felt all of that kind of particular part of the narrative worked really well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's more than one case where a character is about to do a bad thing and justifies it, or their through line to it is, well, if I do this thing, it's actually to the benefit of other character. And at that point, you just want to jump in there and go, no, stop, for the love of God. Like, you're all about to go to hell. Oh, no. And that, it kind of works in that regard, as you say, like, there are, characters will, like, bail off on their own and just cause untold havoc, which, it kind of works well, because it doesn't really come back to punish them, but it says, hey, there's going to be consequences for this, and now we have to watch them all. Also, shout outs to the Manga Plus comments thread. Don't read it too much before you're done, because people like to spoil stuff or make very good guesses. But it was pretty funny watching them go, oh man, this character's actually garbage. Oh shit. Which was quite fun. Which it kind of helps to have, like, the Greek chorus of, oh no, this guy is a prick, or this person is a prick. Oh, thank goodness, other people agree with me. Thanks, internet commenters.
Yeah, it's weirdly, like, normally, yeah, like, internet commenters is something to be avoided, but there is something about the way Manga Plus kind of presents its comments at the end of a chapter that is sort of, it does accentuate the experience if you get to the end of the chapter and you kind of see, like you say, the Greek chorus, this kind of shared feeling of, like, oh no, or, like, in the case of, like, "'Tis Time for Torture Princess" again, just like, oh, that was so nice. Or just, like, it's just this kind of reinforcement of what you've just read with kind of other like minds. And as comment section goes, like, it's relatively decent and thoughtful. And it's like, yeah, I actually appreciate this for once.
Yeah, I feel like the one thing about that comment system is that it kind of is naturally selecting, because it does the whole thing where it floats up votes to the top. Oh, sorry, Christ. But it floats upvoted things to the top, and it actually does act on reported posts. So it kind of, after a while, becomes slightly self-selecting. It's not perfect. Like, there are still times I've found real heinous shit in the comments. But it does work. It works surprisingly often. Like, the rate of hits is certainly higher than most comment threads I've ever seen. I mean, hell, look at YouTube, for God's sake.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, like, this is definitely another kind of good advert for Manga Plus, to be honest. Like you say, like, 24 chapters, it's free, it's kind of low barrier to entry. If you're at all intrigued by, our discussions on this podcast or previous ones where we've talked about it, like, it's definitely worth giving a look, because it is something a little bit different within the kind of tried and tested genres, and it goes some places.
Yeah, I agree, totally. But yeah, also, like, as we've talked about before, when we talked about a series, like, you will know if you're down for it after, like, the first 2 chapters or so, because it kind of hits you with a brickbat pretty fast. Which is helpful, frankly. Cool. And so one last returning champion. I'm going to keep this short because we've already started going long. But The Promised Neverland finished today. Like, approximately 3 hours ago, the last chapter went up in the Shonen Jump app. Chapter 181. I'm not going to spoil it because that'd be mean. But as much as I have been kind of wavering and kind of grumbling audibly at this series for the last, like, I think third, approximately, since a certain big plot event occurred, which again, I'm not going to spoil, but it kind of has now ended, slightly abruptly, but in a way that I think it's managed to cash out its chips and end up in a positive place. Like, there are definitely parts of the last third that I was almost screaming at it to hurry up and end or get back on its feet pronto because it was losing me, and the series was delving in great detail in things I did not give a flying fuck about, and, was just kicking its heels quite a lot. And it cheats its way, not quite cheats, but it has a rather easy out at the end to answer one of the last remaining questions that was outstanding. And it doesn't end in like a complete happiness and rainbows thing, but it does end in a good ending for everyone involved. And yeah, it kind of works out in the end. It works well. I mean, as I say, like, it was a case where, like, whenever we talked about it, I talked about how I was always scared whenever there was a big transition of plot. And at one point, the magic broke for me, and it didn't quite manage to maintain it. And had to spend a good amount of time trying to get me back on board. But yeah, it's now over. I think overall positive. I mean, the first 2/3 where it's completely on its game are gangbusters, and it's a really good read. If you've got the Shonen Jump subscription, then the whole thing's available for you to read, so well worth it. And yeah, I'm interested to see what the author and artist pair do next, because I think they managed to acquit themselves really well with this, grumbling aside. Like, it's still drawn really well. It still has lush art and characters. Emma's Ahoge by the end is almost terrifying in its stature and luxuriousness. But yeah, Promised Neverland, it ended. You know, I've seen a lot of very positive people talking about it on Twitter. I come down perhaps on the more grumpy side. But yeah, it was still a very good read. I'm glad I read it, which, you know, at the end of the day, it was worth my time reading, which, you know, is perhaps higher praise than it sounds like coming from my mouth over this audio recording.
Yeah, and I think particularly for kind of, you know, long-running Shonen Jump series of any kind of description, I feel like they always have the same issue of feeling the need to keep kind of escalating their plot line, and I think at some point they all kind of push it a little bit too far, and it's almost a question of just how bad it gets with a lot of these. So in that sense, yeah, I think it probably does a good job. I'm not completely caught up yet. Like, I think I'm only a few chapters shy of the end at this point. Not helped by the fact that the Shonen Jump app rarely works for me anymore, which is a pain in the backside. Yeah, so I'm definitely kind of interested in finishing it off. I'm kind of like with you. I think there's a point where I became less interested in what it was doing, and I think it's just a problem of its changing stakes, that it goes from an intensely personal kind of dilemma to a far kind of bigger and more all-encompassing one, which frankly is kind of less interesting in a sense and kind of feels less fresh. But yeah, I have certainly broadly enjoyed it, even in its kind of latter chapters. So hopefully at some point I will get through and read those final few chapters when the app deigns to let me actually open it. I
mean, it's also part of it is also available on Manga Plus. You might be able to, depending on how far you're back, you might be able to open it through there.
Yeah, that's true. I may have to do that. Yeah, because weirdly, like the Shonen Jump app now, like 9 times out of 10, it just says fetching store data and then does nothing. And then sometimes you can reboot and it'll work after that. Sometimes it won't. It's basically kind of Russian roulette, but with can you read your manga?
Well, now you get to know how I felt when it didn't work on my phone for a good year. So, although I don't wish it on you or anyone because it's annoying as hell. But yeah, as you say, like I feel like at some point, as you say, like the scope broadened too much and it started asking all these questions that I did not give a fig about, and which, you know, but whatever, I've already gone on about it. But yeah, it's over. As I say, I'm very curious to see what the artist and author do next. Yeah, it was a good read for sure. Like, at the end of the day, gripes aside. Cool. So moving on to the main part of our episode for this evening, is my pick of manga for us both to read and look at. And I picked a doorstop, so I warned Andy like a month in advance because it was only fair. But I picked the recently published by Viz, Junji Ito illustrated edition of No Longer Human. This is a single, omnibus edition that comes in one big 600-page brick. It's available physically or digitally. It's complete because it's one big brick. And No Longer Human is, to give you the boring bit, that I scavenged off Wikipedia about a month ago, but basically No Longer Human is the second best-selling piece of Japanese fiction. It's written by Osamu Dazai, who is one of the luminaries of Japanese fiction writing, or just writing in general. He had a rather torrid life, and some people have obviously pointed to this work as being partially autobiographical or somewhat sort of chest-bearing. He unfortunately committed suicide about a month after the final piece was published, and it was collected into a complete edition because it was serialized in its actual original run. And Junji Ito, the horror manga artist of some repute and enjoyment, has taken up the challenge of adapting this book and putting his own spin on it. There have, of course, been other adaptations of No Longer Human. This is about, I know of at least 4 adaptations of the story in different forms and fashions, different takes on it. The author of Lychee Light Club released a version that was published by Vertical a few years ago, and good fucking luck finding that edition of it because it's long gone. Hella out of print. Hopefully you'll get a digital version like Lychee Light Club itself, but hey. But No Longer Human is about Yozo Oba, who is kind of a child of well-to-do means, although not hilarious 1%er style. He is like a low-down son of a family of aristocrats who work in the Japanese Diet, like kind of in pre-World War II era, kind of a very big element of the modern crashing into the old in this, where his dad is extremely dyed in the wool. There's still a lot of very old structures and a lot of patriarchal power, and he himself kind of coming of age, and it chronicles his life from childhood up to around 39, where the series checks out, which is also unsurprisingly the age that Osamu Dazai reached before he died. But basically, and also Junji Ito, of course, being slightly irrepressible, has a slightly meta element towards the end, where he blends the state of the meta narrative of how the story was published with the actual story itself, by having Osamu Dazai show up as a character in it, which is wild. But basically, Ozo Yoba is... This story kind of comes in the same sort of bucket for me as other things like Dostoevsky, who wrote Tales from the Underground and Crime and Punishment. It comes in the same bucket as, I would say, Franz Kafka's works, like The Metamorphosis, and other stories of that kind, like Marcus Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being. This is basically my attempt to show off the fact that I've read a lot of depressing shit in my life, and this is... It feels like another text in that kind of... canon of people who have their head too far above the parapet of reality and are way too thin-skinned, but also see themselves as the protagonist of life. And so the main character, Yozo Oba, he is very, introspective. He thinks an awful lot. He clearly has some sort of element of depression and anxiety, and he kind of exists as viewing himself from a third person quite a lot, and it leads him to make up a lot of very strange coping mechanisms for real life. For example, he spends his entire life taking everything as a joke. He makes himself into a class clown. He ends up being quite an attractive and sort of interesting person to those around him, especially women, who he basically, to a number, leads down a path of horror, penury, and eventually death in many cases, while at the same time kind of absolving himself of all this trauma and walking away from everything, not unscathed, but basically alive. And things never really catch up to him until the end, when he eventually gets cornered. But he's sort of well-heeled enough that he can wheel his way out of any situation. He is a smart person and can keep himself alive and hustling in the world he finds himself in. And kind of more as a tragedy, because he always has an out to walk away from stuff, or he always has a really terrible friend who can lead him down the wrong path, and his habit-forming activities. He gets involved in drugs and lots of alcohol throughout his life. And it's kind of the story of this person who eventually, like, gets committed to a sobriety institution and announces that he himself is no longer human. He has basically been disqualified from being human, to use the transliterated phrase. And Junji Ito kind of takes this with great aplomb. And for me, the one thing that works is that he doesn't go full horror manga author on it. Like, he doesn't go full spiral or anything, but it keeps things very human and down to earth. And like the one time he brings out his full power of utter wretchedness and horror is when it's illustrating some dried herbs. But otherwise, it keeps things very down and dirty and human, and kind of focusing on the human wretchedness of the situation without bringing in other elements. And it's hard to say that I enjoyed it, but I did. I found it an interesting read. It was a really I haven't read the original source material, but I really enjoyed the read, because it takes its time to kind of illustrate everything, but at the same time, it fully appreciates the fact that, you know, the main character, the point of view character you're seeing, is himself a complete wretch. And even though he himself knows it no longer absolves him of anything. And so it's kind of an interesting read. And, you know, 600 pages seems like a lot, and it is, but it also feels like it takes its time to fully spread its wings and enjoy the material rather than trying to cram it in and leave you kind of a bit undersatisfied or nourished. But yeah, that's what kind of I thought of it. And with apologies to Andy, what did you think of it? Do you hate me for making you read this very long and very depressing story?
No, absolutely not. I'm very much in the same boat as you.
Oh, thank Christ!
I've not. Yeah, after 600 pages, like, no, I hated this. No, it's like I also have never read No Longer Human. It's kind of been one of those things on my kind of almost shameful to-do list of just like, I really should read this because, as you say, it's kind of a big deal in the world of literature. So yeah, I really kind of appreciated getting the opportunity to read it in this form, and yeah, like it feels weird to say I loved it because, yeah, given the subject matter, is like, love is not really quite the word for it. But yeah, like I found it really fascinating. I was kind of a little bit worried at the idea of Junji Ito doing this because, like you, I was kind of worried that he'd horror it up too much. But like, he has exactly the right sort of lightness of touch and knows when to be like, hey, this is literally a horrific situation and I'm going to depict it as such, and when to kind of step back and just let the story and the narrative do the talking. And I think that works incredibly well throughout, like, you know, whether it's kind of the sort of visions that are haunting Oba or whatever, like, Junji Ito is the perfect person to put that across in a sense that is truly kind of unnerving / literally horrifying, but he also knows to be like, hey, this is just some relatively normal stuff going down, like, I'm just going to tone it right down here. And there's always this sense of things being a little kind of unsettling around the periphery of things, but like, it's not full-blown horror, and it knows exactly how to depict all of that. So I think that really helps to accentuate the entire thing from beginning to end.
Yeah, I think the one thing that the horror manga roots come in really strongly is, unsurprisingly, in expressions. Like, especially for like Oba's many female companions throughout the series, who 201 get like really unfairly treated both by him and the world in general, and in some cases by themselves. And, you know, they're not going full on horror, like head craning back, mouth opening, like eldritch nonsense, but even just characters who, when they are disappointed or let down, you see it in their face, especially for the innocent cigarette girl, whose name I've unfortunately forgotten, who is like perhaps the most undeserving of punishment that she receives in the series, because holy shit, she goes through some hell. And, you know, it's one of these things where like she goes through all this hell, and the main character / you know, protagonist point of view character is so self-absorbed he can only say, oh me, I have ruined this perfect flower. And it's like, fuck's sake, like, you know, you're doing this, asshole. But again, this is the plight of the character whose head is too far above reality and can't crane it in at all. But yeah, there's also another section, which I want to call out is, not really a spoiler, but there's a section where the series kind of takes a small break to have a fever dream of Oba's where he is like falling down into hell. Not in an overly graphic way, but he's falling down to hell. And he says, I have 10 burdens inside me, 10 guilts that I need to get rid of. And he basically spends the next, like, God knows how many pages vomiting them up. And, like, it never gets crazy in detail or the art, but it really does feel visceral in how just gross the whole thing is. And also just gets to the point where he's like, well, I'm fucked because I can't even throw this one up. And it's like, oh God, this series, like, this is nuts. So that was a really powerful piece where initially I thought, oh God, this is going to go on forever. And when it kept going, I'm like, no, this is great. Keep going. Like, this is wonderful, if terrible and horrible.
Yeah. And it does a really good job of kind of pulling together, like, everything that you've seen around that character in kind of, in that very visceral way. And I think that was the thing that almost I found the most fascinating about this is that, like, Oba's character, as you say, is kind of, like, pretty much reprehensible in their actions throughout, but the way that character is depicted throughout is not, it's kind of in a way that is maybe not relatable is the right word, but is, you can kind of see their thought processes and, you know, the kind of, the mental health issues that they have from the get-go, and you can kind of like see and trace that pathway. And I think there is something that you can kind of understand in a weird sort of way around that character. And I think that's part of what makes it so powerful. It's not just, look at this terrible person, aren't they terrible? There is that sense of like, look at this terrible person, but you can kind of see the wiring under the board that has kind of pushed them down that path. And between kind of like the nature and the nurture of Oba, you can kind of see from like those early strands as a kid through to kind of the disastrous kind of relationships that they have. There is something that kind of, I guess, spoke to me somewhat just as a human being. Like, you know, you either sort of know people who have those kind of self-destructive tendencies, or perhaps can see them in some far more minor way kind of in yourself. And I think that was the thing that really struck me about this as this being something that is kind of like, it is also an important commentary on kind of human nature and kind of, you know, what it can be left unchecked. That is kind of adds to the horror of it, but also kind of like lends itself to sort of a deeper understanding of it in a sense. And like, I kind of found that side of it fascinating, that here's a character who is, you know, is clearly not really made to be likable, but there is something about them that is kind of fascinating to see sort of being examined and kind of watching them fall apart in the way that they do, as gruesome and grotesque as it is. Yeah,
I think another part of that, you know, at least is one of the reasons why I love this kind of fiction and kind of am drawn to it and reeled off my reading list earlier, is that, you know, he, like Yozo himself can also see it. Like, he can see the light poking through the clouds and it torments him. Like, he can see what is happening and what he is doing and almost how he got there. And that's why it was all this long-winded first person perspective discussion and dissection of himself in an ongoing fashion, is that they can see the horror and the nightmare as well, and how it has like broke upon them, and it torments them because they can see it and they know it as well. And the lucidity never makes up for the fact that they're still stuck being this wretch. It's this sort of thing where the characters themselves are doomed. And if anything, the fact that they can see it just makes them all the more damned and torments them further. But yeah, it's that sort of thing that kind of really kind of pushes it home, and you know, it stops them from being it stops them from becoming too relatable in a way where it's like, oh no, this character does know they're terrible, and you know, it's not some kind of anti-hero, it's just a person who does all this terrible shit. So that's kind of what makes it interesting, is this sort of feedback loop element.
Yeah, and again, I think that is all so well kind of depicted here. Like, it's such a good balance of, you know, throughout the book you kind of get to see Oba being literally kind of haunted by sort of the ghosts of his past, but that never feels like, that's the kind of thing that can be really hokey if you don't play it right. Like, that's the kind of thing that's sort of been done to death in fiction, etc., etc. But like, it's always portrayed here in a really kind of powerful and useful way. It's not just like sudden like, oh look, here's a ghost just to remind you of the bad thing you did. Like it always appears kind of in a context that makes it kind of important and kind of lends credence to whatever else is going on at that moment in time. Like that's the kind of thing where I think, especially when it started turning up early on, I was like, is this going to get kind of old? Is this going to be something that it leans on far too much? But it's always done at the kind of the most important sort of opportunities, and it never feels like it's wasted or it's there just because it's kind of a visual motif or whatever that it's just leaning on.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like that sort of stuff, like the weight of the accumulation of sins, to use a slightly flowery phrase, is one that, like, the fact that it makes sense to be referenced and like looked back upon because one thing very directly leads to another, and there is this ongoing procession of horrors that one leads to another. I mean, like one of the first things that really sets the main character off is when like someone sees through his japery and it ruins him. Like it shakes him to his core of like, no, someone like this character can see through me and I must get close to this person to see what they see, but I also must destroy them. And that, of course, is it continues to crop back up again because it is this inciting destructive incident that just carries on and gathers weight, and as it like the whole snowball rolling down a hill type thing, like eventually it's going to get so big it's going to crush you. But yeah, it's really fascinating. I wonder what you think about the meta element towards the end when Oba meets basically his creator, and they reference the fact there is this weird sort of pseudo referencing about referencing Dazai's own suicide and also his own point when he wrote the story. And what did you think about that? I'm still really kind of tossing it over in my head and not quite sure what to make of it, frankly.
I mean, I felt like it fitted in kind of tonally with the rest of it. It sort of, it worked. Like I feel like I might have come down on it very differently, like had I read the book and had I read the source material as kind of maybe taking liberties. But yeah, I don't know, it felt like the right thing at the right time, and it kind of felt like an interesting sort of insert into that world. Like, and again, I think particularly having been aware, even sort of prior to reading any of this, of the sort of, the talk of semi-autobiographical elements to this book, it almost felt fitting that, there is basically a self-insert character for Dazai that kind of, injects themselves into the latter part of the story. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think it wouldn't have lost anything particularly by not having that, maybe, but I felt like it fitted quite well for me. It worked within the framework of everything else that had gone before. Okay,
yeah, totally. I think one thing it definitely does, like, thinking about what you said there, I think one thing it does do is it gives it a path to the ending where it brings in death of the author quite literally, leaving his character behind in an armchair at the end. And I feel that kind of gives this manga adaptation a way to cleanly end itself, in like a comprehensive manner, both leaving you with the end of Oba and the end of his own creation, which kind of like works as a twofer, really. Like, unsurprisingly, not the happiest ending, perhaps not even the most fitting ending, but it has an ending for sure. Like the last page of it is really kind of like a kick in the teeth. Like not as in like twist, but it's just a case of like, well, here's where we are and this is how we end up. And that's all the story there is to tell. And that's kind of where, like, by the time you've closed the book, you're kind of like, yeah, that was the story. Like, it's done. That's it now.
Yeah. I mean, it almost just kind of signs off with like one final horror for this kind of character that has wished death upon themselves for everything that they've done numerous times, with just kind of a final, like you say, a final kick in the teeth of just like, nope, you still don't get the supposed peace that you were looking for. Like, you're still there with all the memories of everything that you've wrought upon other people and yourself.
Totally. And I think one last thing it does, at least from my point of view, that it because it is from Oba's point of view that you are seeing all of this, there are, like, it does a very light touch, like sort of use of unreliable narrator, where some elements happen and you, after a while, you start to wonder if they did in fact happen or if they happened in the way that Oba imagined them. And it never the one thing that's really powerful about this is it never calls it out or tries to sit you down and say, this and this didn't happen because he's off his rocker. It just goes, no, we're just carrying on. Like, this is Oba's life. This is what his point of view is. And we're never going to definitively say one way or another whether he was right or not. And that makes it more powerful and more sort of, like, you can still kind of intuit where you think you sit on particular actions, especially when it comes to other characters doing things that he interprets in different ways. And it kind of comes across really powerfully when you're like, oh, of course this guy would be unreliable. He spends half his time drinking or high on opium. So, like, what do you think is going to happen?
And I feel like even before that point, there's kind of a feeling that, you know, that there is clearly a mental illness at Oba's core. And
the whole time.
That also lends into that as well, of just like, you know, this could be a kind of, you know, a mental episode where this person is seeing or hearing things that clearly, you know, are not actually happening and don't exist. But yeah, like you say, I think that is actually the thing that is really perhaps the most impressive thing about this is it's at its core, when you kind of look at it as a sort of, you know, as an investigation of kind of the mental illness aspect, because it does really put you into the head of the main character in a way that is kind of scary, because you don't, you know, you are just seeing what they see and you don't really know where the delineation is between things that are actually happening and things that are not. And you know, at times this book can be quite kind of playful with that, in a sense of kind of like leading you down that path and then kind of like leaving you to decide for yourself. But it's also, yeah, like I think it's also equally good at kind of giving you moments that you see and you think, well, surely that is just like a figment of his imagination. And then it kind of circles back around on that. Like, no, actually that is a thing that did actually happen. And, you know, it just kind of becomes all the more shocking for it. So yeah, that's actually absolutely kind of one of the most powerful things I think it manages to do throughout.
Totally. Yeah. Especially when it comes to, as you say, with other characters. I had a point and I've completely forgot what it was. Shit. Yeah, well, I think the other flip side to that is also the fact that there are calm moments. There are moments when things are actually okay, and, you know, pages just pass peacefully, and there are positive, like, sunlit uplands in the life of Oba, and, you know, even the people he's involved with. You can look at them and think, man, you don't deserve this moment of peace, because of all the terrible shit you've done, but it still finds time to say, hey, he's not a complete wreck the whole time. It's just that sometimes, like, life gets him turns him into a wreck. Or there's better ways of phrasing that, but you get what I mean. There are more than, the fact that it shows you the up points makes it all the more powerful. You're like, oh, okay, things are better now. Oh no, fuck, they're getting worse again. So. Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what makes it far more interesting to follow the character rather than somebody who is just like, irredeemably bad in everything that they do, because like you say, there are points where you can kind of see the potential. You can almost see like the alternate reality where it's like, okay, this is a point where you could actually straighten out, and kind of, obviously you can't undo the things that you've done in the past, but you can move forward to a future that is at least happier for you and other people. And then, you know, just as you reach that point, you kind of see those self-destructive elements come to the fore, where it's, you know, you basically see Oba's character realize, like, oh, I'm actually like happy right here and now. I need to smash this somehow. I need to destroy this because I don't deserve it. And it's kind of that I think is one of the really kind of powerful moments that is, like I say, I think is somewhat relatable to a certain extent, where, you know, people do find themselves in a good spot and then just want to break that because they feel like they don't deserve it for whatever reason. And that's kind of a really dark but powerful kind of thing to put across in manga form.
Yeah, totally. The unfortunate boredom of having things go well for once. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I got it. I got this for, like, as I say, I got this digitally because it's 600 pages. And it looked great on my tablet, which was lovely. Looks really great. Junji Ito does a really good job on it. I got it for like £8 because it was on offer when I bought it, which is kind of great value, frankly, and also it's a really interesting read. And yeah, it kind of fits really nicely into stuff that I enjoy reading, even if it does make me feel kind of icky. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much in a very kind of specific wheelhouse. I mean, I think, yeah, like absolutely kind of mentioned, sort of Kafka, Dostoevsky, etc. Like, if you like that kind of fiction, if you like those kinds of narratives, like this is absolutely in your wheelhouse and you should definitely check it out. And yeah, I'm much like you that I love reading stuff like that. I find it fascinating. But yeah, like I also appreciate, maybe not for everybody. So if you listen to this discussion like, oh my God, that sounds miserable, then, maybe not one for you.
Yeah, it takes different kinds, I mean, I remember brief anecdote time. But when I was working in a warehouse for a while when I was on break from university, and I had a copy of Notes of the Underground, and I was reading that during lunch break, and the people I worked with were like, whatever. They were lovely people, but didn't really go in for much of that kind of reading. And one of them said, "Oh, what are you reading?" And I handed it over to them. And like the first page is just like, "I have never lived a life of such awfulness." And it's just like all this stuff, like laying out the main character and how he sees life. And the guy read it and went like, "You're right." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's great. I love reading stuff like this." And he's like, "Okay, dude." And yeah, everyone got a bit leery of me for a while after that. Cause whoops.
Yeah. There is this strange stigma that, yeah, like, because you are interested in reading about kind of the dark soul of the human condition, that therefore, like, you are somehow in that state yourself entirely. And it's like, no, I can be a normal person, but also be interested in this stuff. It's like, just because I listen to podcasts about serial killers doesn't mean I'm a murderer. It's on that same kind of level.
I'm just training to be one. Wait, why are you running? But yeah, I definitely think this was a definite good combination of material and artist. Like, Ito really, it sounds weird, but he doesn't knock it out the park, because knocking it out the park for Ito would be like truly horrifying garbage and making you want to cry. But he knocks it out of the park in doing the material justice. How's that? How does that work?
I think that's exactly it. Yeah, like I say, I was a little bit worried that like, oh, is this going to be like too Junji Ito, and is that just going to kind of dilute the actual story? But I think like it has a real respect for the source material and what that book is trying to achieve and what it's trying to put forward. And it's very much, it's kind of cool to see like a well-known kind of manga author like that know that, okay, like I almost need to take the back seat here. Like I need to let the story do the talking, and I'm just here to kind of put it across and kind of use my talents to accentuate that where it's needed. And I think that's exactly the kind of touch this needed, and like it's pretty much spot on from Ito on that count.
Totally. One final honest to God last thing I want to mention is it knows when Ito should be drawing something and when he can use narration, which is very powerful. Like, I don't know, I definitely think that there are times when Ito looks at something and goes, okay, no, this can be narration. I don't need to draw this. Like, I can get this across in text, and then I can get on to the next fucking psycho-ass thing that I need to draw.
Yeah. I mean, that was another of my kind of expectations / concerns about this, was that it was just going to be super like blocks and blocks of prose, and it was going to be like reading the book but with the odd illustration effectively. But yeah, like that balance is kind of perfectly struck of like, yeah, it knows when, hey, this just needs to be narration, and when it can just be, okay, this is something that I can visually show you, and it will be more powerful in this medium than a bunch of words.
Totally. So yeah, that's No Longer Human, published by Viz, available physically and digitally. I've seen the physical version. It's really nice. The problem is it has a white just cover, and so it might get a bit ratty if you're buying it from a physical bookstore, if physical bookstores still exist. It's been a while since I've been in one, so there you are. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's in shrink wrap, because holy shit.
Yes, yeah, like definitely lots of gore and violence, lots of sex.
Lots of boning.
Yeah,
Jesus.
Yeah, not one to show you.
Yeah, it's certainly sex and not lovemaking. That's for fucking sure.
Yeah, and again, like I mean, that is again another part of this kind of book in terms of its visuals that I think it puts across really well. Like it knows how to depict that stuff to just be like, hey, this is not about kind of a romantic sexual relationship. This is just two people just getting it on because why not? It knows how to play that stuff, as required.
Totally. So, well, with all that, moving on to, perhaps slightly lighter fare, maybe? Andy, you want to take it away with your pick for this episode?
Yeah. So, some crises of a very different sort in this one. So my pick for this podcast is actually a new release from Seven Seas. Kind of literally just came out
like this week, I think.
Before. Yeah, pretty much. And this is volume 1 of Love Me for Who I Am, which is the story of a character who is biologically male, but dresses as a female. And their name is Mogamo Ryonosuke, if I can say it right. And they're basically kind of spotted by one of their classmates, Ewako Tetsu, who obviously kind of like sort of gets the vague deal that it's like, okay, well, you are clearly, dressing, in a different sort of binary gender to what you actually are biologically, kind of like puts 2 and 2 together and comes up with 5 and just decides, okay, I guess you just like enjoy cross-dressing. And it just so happens that he knows of, and his sibling works at a maid cafe where everybody cross-dresses. So he thinks, okay, well, I'll do Mogamo a favor and I'll invite them to work to work at this maid cafe, because, clearly it's a place where they'll be accepted, they'll all kind of, everyone will get on great. This will be fantastic. Which is kind of a pretty massive misjudgment on his part, because all of the maids at this cafe, like, all get involved with this cafe for very different reasons. Like, this is not a singular, just like, oh yeah, we all just like cross-dressing. And so straight away it kind of comes to a head, because Mogimo is just like, no, I'm not here to, be an otokonoko, as the Japanese phrase goes. Like, I am not here to say, like, I am a boy dressing as a girl. Like, I mean, basically, the kind of, the long story short of it is that they are non-binary. Like, they don't see themselves in those explicit terms of being male and female. And this first volume is really just about kind of working through that friction between them and the other characters, who all have their own kind of ideas and ideals for working at this cafe. It's kind of interesting in that sense, because the one nice thing I think about this volume is that everybody is very forthright about their feelings and opinions here. Like, I mean, even the initial kind of invitation of Mogamo to this maid cafe, it's not so much a misunderstanding as an assumption. And from that point forward, everyone is pretty much just like saying how they feel about things and what their own personal take on things is. And it kind of gets through quite a lot of ground quite quickly as a result of that, because everybody is pretty kind of forthright in saying, like, hey, here's my position on this. This is why I'm uncomfortable with using this particular terminology or kind of presenting myself at this cafe in a certain way. And so it's kind of interesting, like, watching these characters work through understanding one another, and also in some cases kind of working through their own kind of issues regarding kind of, their gender and how they perceive themselves and how they want others to perceive them. And alongside that, there's kind of a romance kind of subplot that really comes to a head at the end of this volume, which, I don't know, like, I'm kind of back and forth on how I feel about it going down that angle, because it feels like it suddenly throws a bunch of melodrama at the wall, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to work out in future volumes. The series is also feels weirdly kind of male gazy, like the way everything is drawn. There's a lot of kind of gulping at the characters in their maid outfits, or half in and half out of their maid outfits in changing rooms, in a way that sort of almost doesn't really fit the rest of the narrative. Like, it's kind of, it feels like it wants to sexualize these characters a lot more than they are there for, which is something that I feel like maybe kind of is a little bit unfortunate and kind of like doesn't do the actual subject matter justice. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting first volume for me. Like, I think I want to check out more of it, because I'm kind of curious as to what it's going to do with its characters now that it's kind of got over its initial kind of, its initial discussions and arguments over kind of everybody's sort of individual take on things. Because this feels like a series that could run out of road really quickly, or it could find a lot of interesting things to do. So I'm kind of curious about it. I quite liked it overall. Like, it's definitely this is quite interesting with kind of an asterisk for some exceptions that I'm not quite sure about with it. But yeah, I don't know. I find this interesting, and I kind of enjoyed it overall.
Yeah, man. I got a lot of things I want to talk to you about that. I mean, I think definitely like the main character, like the kind of one of the secondary characters, Tetsu, or one of the main characters, even Tetsu, the extremely generic but slightly bed-headed main character, well, secondary character. Like basically Tetsu and Moguma are the two main characters. Tetsu, like as you say, kind of sees Moguma writing a Tanabata wishing for people that would understand them, and he, as you say, puts two and two together, gets five, but I don't think he does it in any malicious way. I think it is just a case of like he has a big hang up on wanting to be like the super ally, but himself, like kind of, he isn't like cis-het boring dude. He has his own sort of back and forth and has spent so long around what would be seen by others as alternative lifestyles. Blech, I hate that phrase, wish I hadn't said it now. But he's been around this stuff so long that he is like the platonic ideal of not seeing anything. But he is also the person who more than anything will come out to say to people, okay, say it out loud. What do you want here? Like not in an aggressive way, but in a way of like, okay, you clearly have a hang up here, so we need to resolve this. Where, as you say, the main problem is that Moguma gets brought to this maid cafe, this Otokonoko cafe, and then goes, oh no, this isn't me. I thought you said you were bringing me somewhere nice. And it's like, shit. Okay, we got to work through this now, and to make this a place for everyone involved. Because I think, if anything, like, Moguma is still slightly unreconstructed towards the end of this, but I think it's Mei, one of the other maids, who has undergone the most growth and acceptance both of Moguma, but also themselves, of what they actually want out of what they do. Some of the other characters, like, oh god, like Tenchan is very much like whatever. He reminds me of, that the attractive boy from Genshiken, the one who cross-dresses quite a lot because he is so easy to do for it.
Hato.
No, not Hato, the other character, original Genshiken. Goes out with Saki. What's his name?
Yeah.
Yeah, the blonde one, whatever. But no, he reminds me of that, where like Tenchan doesn't really give a fuck, and there's the other character who with black hair who is just out and out gay, but is still in the closet about it, even though they have a boyfriend and they have to make nice like their friends the whole time, even though it doesn't really dig into that in any way. And so the main thing I'll say about this series, and I'll be interested if you agree with me here, Andy, is that the one thing this series does that kind of both limits and also makes it slightly more successful is it picks its battles and its engagement spheres really carefully. Like each chapter will introduce something, but then will clearly demarcate the bounds of debate and discussion. And it will say, okay, we're only talking about this very small square of things, and we're not going to take the huge big picture, but we're going to look and laser focus on this small little conflict that's occurred, and we're going to focus on it with all the characters, resolve it, and then we can move on at the end of the chapter. That's how I kind of felt about the series. Did you feel that at all, or is it just me? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think I kind of saw it more as being a very kind of like personal thing for those involved. Like, yeah, this definitely is a series that kind of comes out to make broad sweeping statements. And I feel like that's kind of its raison d'etre in a sense. Like it's very clearly out there as like, hey, this isn't kind of a very simple check a box on a form kind of thing. Totally. Like everybody has a very unique idea of how they want to be perceived and, how they perceive themselves. And like, I think it does a good job of kind of keeping it constrained to this small set of characters who all have kind of a very different idea of how they want to be perceived, from literally like, yeah, I don't really care, I just like wearing the outfit, through to, a very precise, like, this is, this is how I see myself in terms of gender. And I think there is a limit to that, which I think is kind of why I'm kind of curious as to like, how does this go in future volumes? Because it feels like it's resolved a decent chunk of the core of that in volume 1, and like, what comes next after that. But yeah, like I think it's quite a good framework for it to work within for kind of the series in question, because I don't think it would necessarily work if it tried to go too far beyond the bounds of that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I kind of keep comparing it to, which is not entirely a fair comparison, but I keep comparing it to Our Dreams at Dusk, which, it's not the same thing at all. It's still, it's an LGBTQ plus manga, but it has very different stakes and very different tenor and very different characters. But the one thing it does do masterfully is it manages to weave everything together into this, forgive me, but it makes everything a marvelous tapestry where one event knocks onto other events and the whole thing moves forward as a whole. Whereas in this series, it feels like it picks its battles very carefully, which again facilitates discussion and character growth and, sort of exploration. And as you say, like, it's very important to point out the fact that, like, you can't just lift and place the same thing to others. If anything, you're doing a massive disservice to them because you're taking away their oasis that you've managed to create, even if, like, almost by accident. Whereas this series, it picks individual things to hammer away at and resolve. And as I say, I think it does so successfully. Like, I think, as I say, the main character that I kind of enjoyed the discussion and growth of was May, who kind of, like, if anything, has more of the actual focus than, Kotoko. Wait, is that the main character's name? Shit. Mogumo, sorry, yeah, close. But yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, we talked about, the bad idea about having assumptions, but then there's the assumption that, oh yeah, of course, Tetsu and Mogumo are going to end up in a relationship. Like, we're going to use that as a plot point. And I'm sat there going like, no, can you not? Like, do you have to bring this in 2 chapters in? Like, can you leave it for a bit because you're still exploring the characters' individuals? Do you have to then suddenly make this relationship a thing that has to happen? Which, at the end of this, as you say, at the end of this first volume, there's like a big discussion about it. And it's like, really? Like, I'm not really in for this right now. Like, I'm not really interested in this, in this storyline that you're already winding up to release.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's more a case of, it's too soon and it's not really kind of plotted out in a way that is particularly kind of, maybe believable is not the word, but it's not particularly interesting for sure.
Yeah, like, especially from Tetsu, who basically is like, almost, like, bless his soul, he's like a nice character, but he's a nothing person so far.
Yeah. And there's no real sign of kind of, like, the whole initial premise of is just like, this person, like you say, he sees the whole, like, Tanabata sign thing, is just like, I just want to help this person out. There's no, even if it had set that up as an initial, like, I'm kind of fascinated by this person, maybe I can help them out. But, like, it's set up very simply and purely as just a kind of doing them a favor, basically. And there's no real writing that joins the dots from there to kind of, like, romantic interest. And it all kind of feels like it moves too fast and too conveniently, because especially kind of given the sort of the dilemma that it sets up for Tetsu of just, like, being uncertain as to, like, his own sort of sexuality and feelings. Like, it feels like it hasn't really set that up in a way that is particularly interesting for something that should be super interesting to, like, explore that character and, where they're coming from and what their feelings are. But it feels like it's just been kind of lumped on them as a kind of, like, necessity to, as a plot point, and that's kind of not really particularly helpful when, you've got characters that are kind of interesting and quite three-dimensional in terms of, how they've been presented in this volume, and then that whole plotline just feels kind of tacked on at the end of it.
Yeah, it's really weird that they're giving, like, perhaps the most impactful, like, storyline point to the character who does nothing and is basically a zero. Apart from having this, like, constant refrain. Well, I mentioned 3 times this refrain of, like, permanent allyship, which, I don't know, if anything, is kind of a poisoned word at this point, given other events that have happened, but that's outside the scope of the actual manga. So, hey. But yeah, it kind of gets a bit bizarre like that. Yeah, so interested to see where it goes. And it's clearly setting up this big web of people fretting over Mogumo without listening to them. And I think that is the one thing the series has managed to do, is have characters say to each other, hey, listen to this character, or listen to this character, listen to people talk when they want to say something. Which, is still a good message, because you still need to do that, frankly.
Yeah. And I am interested to see if it does more with its kind of the other sort of members of its broader cast. Because, like, as you say, like, May's character character almost feels like they should be the main character of this thing, because they have kind of a super interesting thing going on where, you know, they're not even really sure about what they want themselves, and it's kind of, you know, helping them to figure out what they actually want, and which is, in itself is kind of interesting, you know, watching May being kind of basically made to kind of verbalize, like, look, what is it that you're looking for here, and like, you know, what is the end game for you there, and you know, watching that actually kind of help them figure some stuff out about themselves is kind of interesting. So yeah, like I am curious to see where it goes. I mean, I think there's like 3 volumes out in Japan thus far, so it'll be interesting to see where it goes. But yeah, like, it's just the kind of surfacing of that sort of whole romance subplot as kind of what seems like it's going to be the big driver of volume 2 was kind of like, like maybe you can turn that around to be something more interesting, but it's certainly not the thing that jumps out from the page as being, oh, here's the thing I really want to see a whole bunch of from this series.
Yeah, I'm still much more interested in just the daily life of Mogumo and like their general sort of fitting in, etc. So that's more interesting to me before you start doing relationship nonsense. And one thing I want to mention, you mentioned at the start about the art, and yeah, I have I'm not going to say it's a theory because that sounds a bit grand, but it gave me massive mobile phone game vibes. Maybe it's just me playing mobile games a lot, but it gave me colossal mobile game character vibes where, you know, you see the characters in different outfits. They're all like generically cute in this sort of, you know, sort of gender busting way. Like, it kind of gave me that feeling. Like, they look like Cancoles or, you know, like Azure Lanes or your, the other one, the Arknights. Like, it looks like one of those, they all look like those sort of characters, especially when they present as female, because they just come across as like mobile phone JPEGs where they're looking cute or a bit like and also they have that same sort of subservience look to them because you are the master, collector, you know, director, general, whatever. Maybe it's just me that I've had my brain poisoned by all of them, but that was a definite vibe I got from them is, oh, these are totally of a kind of mobile phone characters where they are there to look cute and spout lines at you every now and then. Just that in this case, they're in a manga.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I maybe wouldn't make the mobile phone game connection, but I think, yeah, the kind of generic cute character thing is definitely there. Like, you could pick up one of any kind of dozens of slice of life manga from, like, you know, a fair few years back when that was kind of the hot thing, and you would find characters that looked almost exactly like these. And it does feel kind of quite, like, it doesn't quite fit with kind of what the narrative is trying to do. And yeah, like, it just felt, it felt weird in general. Like, again, I feel like there's a lot of kind of odd sort of low angles, and again, so lots of kind of locker room discussions where everybody's in the middle of kind of dressing and undressing that kind of felt like it didn't need to be there necessarily, and it was always just teetering on the kind of on the edges of going into kind of skeevy territory that I didn't always appreciate. Like, the artwork kind of looks good in its own general sense. Like, I feel like if this was laid onto another series, then I wouldn't have commented on it beyond just like, oh yeah, it looks quite nice and cute. But it just, for these kind of characters and for this subject matter, it just felt like it didn't quite fit.
Yeah, I maybe wouldn't say, I mean, I think the characters look good, but I think most of the settings look kind of trash. There's more than one case where the background art looks really strange in terms of perspective and sizing. And of course the characters are mostly front and foremost, so you get to see them a lot, but a lot of the time I was like, okay, I was sat there reading it thinking like, okay, you clearly don't really care about the background, you just want the foreground, the characters, but every now and then you have to show some background to have this work as a manga, which perhaps sounds a bit cruel. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, like, the mobile phone element also is the fact that, like, you get a lot of shots where, like, you know, of skirts hitting the floor, so you get the picture of the feet with the skirt around it, or people taking off tops, as you say, and, you know, arms strategically in front of chests to make it look ambiguous. And a lot of that sort of element, which again, like, kind of teeters on this whole, like, not quite teen plus, you know, sort of soft teen, like, as I say, like JPEG, fiending, which, you know, again, kind of makes it, you know, a little more leery than is perhaps comfortable, especially when it is, trying to have its cake and eat it almost, of having these like important discussions that it is loads focusing on, and then it's like, oh, isn't all this a bit titillating? It's like, well, no, not really. I kind of just want to hear what the characters have to say. Like, can you not make them? And also, like, more than once it like references sex appeal in the whole thing. I'm like, can you just have the characters talk? Like, that's all I really want right now.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like at least one kind of really crucial conversation like in this volume where kind of, you know, people are finally kind of hammering out, you know, what they want out of these things, yeah, whilst they're also kind of getting undressed and getting changed and stuff. And it's just like the constant switching between like incredibly important dialogue and, like you say, kind of like, oh, look at this kind of slightly titillating, you know, low angle shot is kind of, it feels weird. And I mean, I found it kind of fascinating, like reading the author's notes at the back, which it kind of sounded like the author was writing something that was probably going to be kind of gross. And then as it happened, they were sort of doing their research and kind of happened upon the idea of kind of, you know, being non-binary, and then actually did some legitimate research and was just like, oh no, this is actually an important topic that like needs to be treated kind of carefully and seriously, and actually kind of did a bit of a 180, because the vibe that I got from kind of like the afterward was very much just like, yeah, I was writing the main character to be really like manipulative, and it's like, oh no, were you going down the direction I think you were? Because that was a very different series that I don't want to read. And like, kind of kudos for actually kind of like looking at that and changing tack in the way that this series clearly has. But that was kind of an interesting, just like, oh, okay, this feels like it's changed quite a lot from the initial concept that was in the artist's mind.
Yeah, totally. Especially when it comes to like the main character design, like the main character's like entire personality going from like pixie dream girl to, oh no, this is actually an interesting exploration of all this. Weird. Yeah, it's also like, one thing I will say is there's some really good faces and like, you know, sort of small versions of characters and goony expressions, including the fact that the main character's hair turns into like Pikachu ears when she's in her small form, which is adorable and I think is great. So yeah, there's that. Cool.
Yeah, but yeah, it was an interesting one for sure, and it's like I think I'll probably read volume 2 just because I kind of want to see where it goes and what it's doing with it, and that will be the kind of make or break, because like I say, there's definitely a lot of heavy lifting done in this first volume, but that does also make me worry that it's kind of done everything it's going to do, and it's just going to turn into kind of relationship drama from here on in.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I'm probably going to wait and see what you think about this. So I'm going to let you take the plunge on this one, Hanley. But yeah, it was interesting. It was certainly an interesting read, and I'm still, you know, as is probably obvious from me gabbing on this podcast, as I'm still kind of chewing through my thoughts on it even a few days later. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting thing. But also at the same time, it still makes me want to go back and reread Our Dreams at Dusk, because holy shit, that was a good manga.
Yeah, I still need to read the final volume.
Oh man,
of that,
you do!
actually.
It's so good.
Yeah, like it's been set on my list for such a long time, and then other things always come up and interrupt. So I've got some time off coming up, so that will definitely be on my list to resolve that terrible outstanding issue.
Sweet. So anything else to mention about Love Me for Who I Am, Volume 1?
No, I think that is everything.
Cool. So moving on to what we talk about next episode. So, I have picked, for our next topic is volume 1 of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Aposims, which is the newest manga currently ongoing from Satomu Nihei, who I have talked about previously at great length. I have this in like 3 different forms because of different Humble bundles and stuff, so I'm pretty sure you have a copy of it as well, Hanley.
Yes, yeah, I probably have it in a Humble bundle somewhere that I need to remember how to access.
Yeah, totally. It's like, where's that email? Where's that key? Oh god. So yeah, that's what I'm picking. And how about you, Andy?
Yeah, so my pick for the next episode is basically just because I want a podcast of us saying the name of it over and over again, because I have picked Kuma 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 Bear Volume 1, which is a series that just makes me smile every time I see it mentioned on the internet. It's just like, that's a good name. It's a terrible name, but it's also a good name.
Is this the light novel or the manga version?
This is the manga version.
Okay, good. Thank God. Right, yeah.
Because I'm gonna foist the light novel upon you soon, I suspect, but not.
Oh
this
God. Maybe it's me, but every time I read that title, I think it's Kuma 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 Chameleon. You know, like the fucking song.
I mean, it is hard not to complete that in your head. So.
Yeah, God. Maybe I'll do some audio editing before next episode to shoehorn that gag in again. Cool. So, thank you very much for listening. This is, as mentioned, has been Screentone Club. You can find our website at screentone.club. If you like the podcast, please consider telling a friend, tweeting about it, talking on Discord, Reddit, I don't know. That stuff really helps with getting the word out there. Word of mouth is still the most powerful way of getting podcasts out there. Thank you everyone who's rated and reviewed us on iTunes and other podcatchers. Really appreciate everyone who's done that. You can also tweet us at Screentone Club, or one word. You can also email us, show@screentone.club. My name is Elliot Page. You can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter. And although I think this podcast might be coming out right at the end of it, I have a video game in the currently ongoing itch.io bundle for racial justice and equality, which gets you, like, I think at last count, 1,600 different games or pieces of content for pay what you want from the minimum of $5. So if nothing else, even if you don't want my game about croissants, you should probably get that bundle just because you get so many other great games and really interesting pieces of art. So, and also it goes to a good cause. Hooray. So that's my plug out the way. Andy, how about you?
And you can find me on Twitter at Hannah's1979.
Grand. So, thank you very much from me and from Andy. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.